is there public transit in our scheme, with the aside comment that it might be un-American? First of all, it might seem un-American, but it is definitely not. And it is the current concern of a number of communities to look again at the mass transit that has been allowed to deteriorate or be neglected as an important part of city and town infrastructure, a neglect that has occurred really since the Second World War. And there are lots of examples of communities dealing with that. This is, again, an economic and social issue because mass transit systems can be very expensive. We were discussing it at dinner this evening that, in fact, that we could have dealt with that much more intensely. It's probably quite certain that a rail line, any kind of rail line, is not practical for that area. That at most some sort of trolley system, such as Portland is returning to its city with great success, would be the best solution. To a great degree, that whole issue depends on how much development is foreseen for that area, and that's something that you all really have to get involved in. The right-of-way, by the way, is extremely narrow and does not have a lot of leeway for additional work in it, as it is now. Yes? I didn't understand the second question. You are right about the sprawl. It's already occurring. I mean, it's running from McGalliard out into 332 already, and that is inevitable unless you decide to do something about it. That's what this presentation really is about. And you are right also that the intersections will be the focus for any future development. That future development is not necessarily a negative thing. If you imagine it happening as the kind of strip development you have now all the way out, I think you can all agree that you'd rather if that didn't happen the way that it's happening now. The proposal that I had up on the wall for typical or prototypical intersection is based on the idea that, yes, there may be development focused at an intersection, and it should be planned in an orderly way so that it might become the focus for a community local to that place, so that it is not just part of an endless sprawl of unidentifiable stuff. You can't tell where you live relative, from one intersection to the next. But they might even become small towns of the type that are some distance off 332 in either direction, in which there is a focus for a suburban community that is around it. I think unless you really want to legislate against development, you have to imagine a scenario in which you make it constructive places for living and working and shopping together. Yes?
You're saying no development or not much development, but I see an awful lot of it. I'm wondering what happens to the rest of Muncie if you continue development along this least used of the entrances into Muncie?
I am not saying no development. And you're right, you're seeing it. What we are saying is that it's up to you to decide whether you want that development or not. We cannot tell you. There is a strong pressure for that kind of development along arteries like this. If you do not want it, and we couldn't decide that for you because we had, as I said at the beginning, conflicting input from a number of people about that. And I think you would find that to be quite a civic or quite a public discussion in town if everyone decided to get together and decide what to do about it.
What happens to the rest of Muncie? 75% of it is in no way connected to 32. What happens to that?
That's one of those economic and social questions that we spent a lot of time discussing. You do, when strips develop, you're right. A great amount of energy is often taken out of downtowns, and it's a post-World War II phenomenon common throughout the country in which downtown dies because everybody starts moving out to the strips. You can avoid that if you can get together to say that you don't want that to happen and that you are going to somehow encourage business to return or to be maintained downtown. That is one of those secondary issues that I mentioned at the end that this kind of study really can spawn, in which you can decide certainly that you should encourage development downtown with all sorts of incentives and discourage it on the strip if you want to maintain the focus within the downtown. I think everyone on the team would have no trouble supporting that because our intent, let's say our priorities or our values are for focusing communities and not dispersing them. But that's a big issue. That's a bigger issue to take on than just saying we're going to order what's likely to happen by all reasonable patterns, current patterns. Yes.
Approximately, I was going to say 10 years ago, but it wasn't that long ago. Plan Commission, government run Plan Commission, once again, proposed that 400 zone 40 acres on each side of a massive chunk on each of the four corners, and let that be future commercial development. And at that time, I'm going back 7 to 8 years ago, I think. But anyway, it was, and by law, and my prohibited. Anyway, that plan was, I don't think the motion got seconded. It didn't get any place. And hindsight is fantastic, you know, but that was really great at that time.
You're saying you would like to see development controls to curtail development along 332.
I like to see clusters, you know, you gotta have development. I mean, people need services, people want, they don't want to go miles or anything. But I prefer clusters, like you indicated here.
Thank you. There's some people who haven't spoken yet. Yes.
Study speaking about the 5 years ago, which is rather recent. You know, it was asked for by the Board of County Commissioners. Some of the comments were by the property owners, don't just let us come back and tell you what we want to do. My question to you is, do you think that this community, from what you've heard in the past few days, will follow anything you presented tonight?
I think you have two questions there. In fact, would the community stand for curtailing development in the future if it hasn't in the past? And what chance does our plan have of being implemented if curtailing development does not seem to have a good chance? The beauty of our plan is that, in fact, it does not affect development, and it does not detract in any way, but rather enhances the properties along the road. It does not in any way impede or prevent their development if that's what you desire for them to be developed. It can happen whether they get developed or not. And it was really quite a struggle to get to the point where we could bring something to you that could let you have it both ways, have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. because you could be making this civic place as well as allowing development or not. That's a big issue that's really up to you. And the trees will be there whether you do or not. In the back. The killer trees. I think one of the introductions mentioned that Dave Ellis kept us on track the whole time about not putting things into the right-of-way in such a way that when your car runs out of control or you've had too much to drink, that you run into a tree and basically that's the end of you. And I'm sure there are local stories in your tradition of that. There are certain rules about how close you can get to the pavement of a state highway with obstructions like trees. And that's what I was referring to, that in fact we named the big trees, the ones that would really define the space, killer trees somewhat humorously because they are the big trees that when they are close to the road might be dangerous, but they are not close to the road. Yes? The question is any of this work beneficial to the students here at the college? Should the students answer that? The student team members? We have a drawing out in the exhibition area, 3 very light black and white drawings that are analyses of community facilities and amenities. And one of them has civic elements, I believe it's called, and Ball State University is one of them. You will notice that on our drawings, we've recommended the extension of the landscaping that we're doing along 332 in towards the university campus so that that beautiful entry does continue to that very important part of town. So in so much as we're doing something for the city and the county, we're doing something for Ball State as well. What this can be as a learning exercise for the architecture students, I think it can be very many things that you might take that question up with your faculty, but one of the things that would be interesting is if you understood, and actually even from your fellow student participants, what kinds of input, discussions, the process influenced the final product. You know, if we did come in with any preconceived notions, a lot of the public was asking us, what are your preconceived notions? And we probably all came in with some kind of notion or another, but they were drastically modified by the kind of research and analysis that we did as a group. And also, I think a very important aspect of the product is the fact that there was a team hashing out issues and coming to conclusions, and it was a very rational kind of exercise. It was not a personal whim or form making that's derived from a personal agenda, but rather something that came out of a tremendous amount of rational input and effort. Teamwork. Another question? Yes, we did some very rough numbers initially that were meant to be more of a relative scaling of the levels of effort. And I named those scales as the landscape being one, setting up design guidelines for building as 2, and the master plan in which you actually determine methods of growth. And I believe, I hate to say this because everybody's gonna say, wow. But in a very, very rough estimate, we estimated that putting in the first row of trees, the length of the highway would be under $2 million. that is the kind of thing that comes out of working in a room with people who have experience in doing this sort of thing, but not any kind of real cost estimating that involves local materials or methods, and the kinds of things that really should be studied by a task force, which could get down to the brass tacks of who pays for it, where does it come from, how quickly does it go in. One of the things that task force will have to consider is if there are trees to be put in by property owners as the land develops, how do you keep some sort of uniform line and height of trees if they're being put in at different intervals? You know, if you put in a sidewalk 2 years later in this property than you did next door, the difference doesn't show up as much as it might in trees that are several years older or younger. But all of that stuff really can be worked out in a continuing process. All the way in the back.
If I were a property owner or a realtor, what might I do to help you see this plan come to fruition?
That's a good question. I gather that you're neither. Well, I think the first, and we discussed this as a group, that the first plan of action really has to be this group of people who could begin to think about how to do it. Certainly, the team members who remain in town have the experience in various areas, including if you were to consider, if that task force were to bring before the citizenry the issue of actually putting some farmland in trust. There are people on your faculty who know how to, what options are open in that area in terms of not only the legal structure, but funding. So I think that in a way an important aspect of this presentation has been saying that realtor and that landowner should become involved to see something like this happen in such a way that it is beneficial to everybody. Maybe one more question, and then the seats are probably getting hard by now. Probably more destructive to the environment of such a corridor is not so much what the highway department puts in, because that's fairly uniform. Admittedly, it's not the most graceful that it's ever been in history. There are wonderful examples of, let's say, immediately pre- and post-war elements of highway design, which some of us might prefer. But in general, it's uniform, and it's not, it's kind of an accepted uniformity or something that you're used to reading. It has a certain kind of symbolism and signal. I think the more problematic elements are the signs, shapes, and varying setbacks of buildings which line the highway. Those, in fact, are much more destructive and potentially constructive if you control them with certain kinds of ordinances aimed at harmonizing them. I think that's all. Thank you.
Great job. Elizabeth, I think the applause speaks for itself. In conclusion, I'd like to say thanks to the design team. They've done a great job in providing us with the tools to begin the dialogue. And that's in our community, if we choose to, for improving 332, or in fact creating a road that we can all be proud of and become the gateway of Muncie. Our thanks at this time to, again, to Ball State University, to Ball Brothers Foundation, and to Ball Corporation for providing the in-kind and the finances to make this charrette a reality. I would say that the team members are up front here. You can identify them. They have a scholarly look on their face. Or they'll be out by their drawings. And if you have any questions or if there's anything else you'd like to say to them, why, please seek them out and do that. Thank you for coming. And we hope that this is not the end of Charrette 332. Thank you.